It's a rainy day here, so it's and cold. And the only reason I know that is because on my day off, I got called in to fill in for somebody on a shift. So of course, as soon as I told anybody that I had the day off today and was going to work on some projects today and be on here on time, I got to go work a shift. Of course I do. Of course I do. So anyway, magic systems. Sort of where we left it off last night was looking at specifically the Bard and Ranger potentially here. Now, I mean, we talked briefly about the arcane options in Fighter. But let's have a look, pulling up some of the information in D&D about bards. Whether scholar, skald, or scoundrel, a bard weaves magic through words and music to inspire allies, demoralize foes, manipulate minds, create illusions, and even heal wounds. Now, I struggle a little bit when I do stuff like this, partly from the ideas that we look at traditional views in pop culture versus views in mythology and the origins of an idea. So here's the thing. Once upon a time, there was a class of people who were the oral history keepers, the songwriters, the poets. Like if you look at Greece in particular, you have orators, Homer, who told the epic tales of Greek heroes, the story of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. He told them as stories. The story of Atlantis was told as a story. And we have a tendency to think of that as just storytelling, but for a lot of human history, that falls under the purview of very sacred arts. The preservation of the history of the people is foundational to the identity of a population and how they conduct themselves. We have a similar role today in what we call the Fourth Estate. We have in the U.S. government, we've got the different things that balance against each other, but there's what's called the Fourth Estate, if I remember correctly, is the media. The one who breaks it down and tells it to the people of the region what's going on, how it's happening, the effects of it, and just communicates the goings on of the world to the people. So we do have a sort of a similarity to that, but we've broken it away from the idea of bards, where somewhere along the way they became minstrels, not just bards. So I do feel like I'm torn a little bit there. We have a tendency to want to look at it as the musician who inspires them on the field of battle. But I also kind of want to use the character archetype more for that intrepid reporter, because that's what it is. And there's aspects of it that are the spy, the the gatherer of information and the collector of rumors. So there's a part of that. A good example in fiction is Dragon Riders of Pern has the Harper's Guild, and the functions that the Harper's Guild performs are much more interesting a way of looking at how a bard might play their role. A traveling bard, like in Pern, Harper is part of a guild, and the guild hall has control and educational facilities to train young harpers. And you have the apprentices and the journeymen and the master harpers, and it's a guild. It's a hierarchical series of mastery steps to the master, the one who decides the course of events for the whole guild. And then the function of those people is very often an apprentice is usually assigned to study and learn from their masters. And it's usually you have one overarching master, and you have others who are your superiors, who that master will set you up to learn from, so that your skills can be developed and become an asset to the guild. So now you have that concept of where they come from, what they do in the wider society when they get outside of that guild. Oftentimes you'll have things like the wandering journeyman, I guess is the term they use most often. Harper was somebody who would travel to the different holds, the different kingdoms or fiefdoms, or however the structure would be in a different type of setting. They're essentially city-states. You travel to each of those, and so I guess in a feudal system you would have the king or emperor and the dukes, barons, and whatnot all around them, and then subjects of those people. The subjects of the baron would be maybe smaller villages that owe loyalty to their baron or whatever. But the journeyman harper would travel from the central cities where they would circle back to on a regular basis and pick up the latest news and some of the newest songs about events in history going on, and then cycle back through, and they would weave those together in a way that would get the listeners, in the feast hall gatherings, they tell a story that is about those people. Your village is a village of people who have always been loyal to the king or the baron or whichever it is, and have always sent out heroes like the time such and such, and you tell a story of that hero who performed a great service to the kingdom and the baron. And then you would follow that up with story of events happening somewhere else that they don't have access to personally. Like, no traveler has come from the north side of the country, so they don't have any information about what's going on in that area. And so they get news that way, but they also get stories of places that are not their own as sort of role models and things to emulate, telling you, like, your kingdom is filled with people who fought in this great war. And here's an example of somebody from one of the northern kingdoms that died valiantly to serve the kingdom. Now you have sort of like legends to model yourself out, or see as what model citizens are, and how to grow something like that within your own community. And so it has a definite aspect within the overall community. There's also a lot of, I don't want to call it risk, but there's a tendency for that type of person, somebody who has that amount of influence, the one who's the control of the news from different areas that you don't see or hear from otherwise, the one who tells you your own history and tells you who you are and gives you a sense of your own identity. Those are two very powerful things. And having a sense of the nuance of, if you say it just this way, you call into question the loyalty, but not by questioning them, but just making them wonder about it themselves to the point where they'll be desperate to prove. And so you can lay into the mind of somebody a nagging question and the implied expected answer, so that when somebody's, like, I'm not dishonorable. Of course I'm not. I'm part of our population and we are very loyal people. And they'll desperately, unconsciously try to prove that. And in the attempt to prove that, the bard has sort of manipulated somebody into performing a desired effect that maybe benefits the Harper bard in particular, the Harper's Guild, or the kingdom as a whole. And they don't always have to be the same goals. Sometimes they may be in conflict with one another. And that sort of aspect of it is where you get legends of bards or harpers or minstrels who, when treated unkindly by royalty of one area, can make satirical or harsh songs about that person. And the result is a sort of blight, a curse placed on that person, a sickness. And that sort of thing, like, yeah, but it doesn't have to be specifically songs, although that is a format that's very often used. Now, one of the things that's important to keep in mind is, especially when we look at things like the Greco-Roman model of that, you have the orators, the people who would tell stories. And again, it's not just storytelling and poetry and songs. It's especially visible when you look at the muses. The muses were sort of the patron goddesses of the orators. And what you have for the different muses, the 9 muses as they're listed, are the muse of epic poetry, the muse of history, the muse of love poetry, the muse of music, the muse of tragedy, the muse of sacred poetry. So in that case, that's bordering on the edge of church hymns kind of thing. The muse of dance, the muse of comedy, and the muse of astronomy. Now, the art of astronomy was something that was used to understand what's happening. It's very tightly interwoven with astrology. So there is some sort of mystical prophecies and those types of things woven into some of that. So there's epic poetry and love poetry, I think, are very two different feels of things. But if you look at love poetry, tragedy, comedy, and to a degree dance, these are in a large way cultural expression and entertainment and building a sense of community. And then you look at things like astronomy/astrology, sacred poetry, the histories, and epic poetry, the legends and mythology. And to a certain degree, the music, like it's basically, it's a really good metaphor for exploring what television is. What we have on television. We have the news, and we have the history, and we have the entertainment, the romance and drama and comedies and action adventures and legends and fairy tales, the tragedy. And in a lot of ways, these are things that we can use to model how we experience our lives. You know, we can gain an understanding of the hardships of life by seeing the stories of other people who had hard lives. And we can see that as a, like, when we come to a moment in our own life where it's hard, we can say, like, we've seen somebody survive this in stories and legends. And so that kind of motivation can push us through to a point where we can keep pushing on this until we get to the other side of it. So that aspect is something we see in the legendary bards. Now, how that translates in game terms is it's weakly translated. We see a lot of the tendency to refer to bards as, you know, if you're trying to sneak and somebody needs to add a little extra bonus to their ability to sneak, the bard's going to sing a sneaky song. And so now the person, like, it's so comedically badly handled in that regard that I feel like there has to be a better way to do that. And I do feel like including some of that intrepid reporter aspect of it, and the news sharer, the news representative, the one who has the stories to tell, there's room for more of that. And I feel like the way they do it in gameplay does a disservice to a bard. The bard is sort of a bonus healer, somebody who's there who can do a healing spell if you're hurt too much. They can give you inspiration so that you can, you know, they'll sing you a song about the glories of a hero in the past, and you can go into battle feeling pumped up. It's like a pep band before a fight. And I feel like that's a pretty massive disservice. I feel like it would be interesting to see if you can expand a little bit more on, I think what I said yesterday is, for the bard, having a ability like inspiration but handled differently. Instead of being you're inspired to do this thing, like what I said yesterday was, have you ever had a song stuck in your head? And sort of like their ability to get ideas stuck in the head of other people. That I want to tap into. And I want to tap into the spin doctoring that you can get from media. And I want to tap into the idea of, I mean, we have that inspiration, spin doctoring, and there is a little bit of the mystical in it with the predictive, because the Greeks have their orators and their storytellers like Homer, their epic poets and things like that. The Celtic peoples had what was traditionally called bards. They also had a more mystical society called the Fili. And you have in some of the Norse societies the Scaldi and people like that who have a much more mystical nature. They're the ones who could read runes or do some read the signs. Now, in Celtic cultures, a lot of that was shunted over onto the Druid. And the Druid actually was, there was a group of people that was everything at one point, and then the Celtic peoples split into, I think, 3 different groups. The Bard was the lowly poet. The Fili was the philosopher and elite bard. And then there was one that took over the responsibility of judge and leadership aspects. And then druids were mystical, took over the mystical aspects. And so they really just kind of fractured that. I don't think it ever really quite did such a split in Greco-Roman cultures. And there is a bit of a split in the Norse cultures for some of that. And I mean, you have some similar functions being served by peoples in the Native American cultures, and the Aboriginals have people like that. And so, like, the preservers of stories. So in that sense, it's historians and it's cultural preservation. So I think an important aspect of using a bard in a story, like any video game or role-playing game or even stories, is to have the ability to draw up the power of the past. And there's an aspect in some of the other classes, a feature that's parallels some of that. So the barbarian class in particular has a couple features that I want to pull up here. See if I can pull that up. Okay, so bard. Okay, so let's pull up the barbarian, which is the one that has some things that I think would be worthwhile tapping into. So in D&D in particular, they have a tendency to have different classes that you can play, and each class has subclasses. So the barbarian has what's called primal paths. Now, the barbarian has the possibility of being the path of the zealot, in which case you're a beholden and chosen of a divine entity or a demonic entity, and so you are the chosen champion of that entity. There's the wild soul, which, if I remember, let's see. Okay, so yeah, the zealot is just a lunatic, furious fighter barbarian in the service of deities or some other entity. The wild soul is one who's sort of been living primitively, almost like when you think of a barbarian, you can think of Conan the Barbarian, but you can also think of Tarzan. And Wild Soul is very similar to a Tarzan who was raised in the forest of elves and gnomes and other forest creatures. So they're constantly exposed to the magical entities and the magic of weird forests. Neither of those really leads itself particularly well to bardic capabilities. But we are looking next at Path of the Totem Warrior in Barbarian. And what they do for the Totem Warrior aspect of that is it's a spiritual connection to a spirit animal or spirit guide. Now, you can take that concept of a spirit guide or a spirit animal, and instead of doing an animal, the spirit of a people, instead of who is the animal of this person? Are they a bear? Are they an eagle? Instead of doing that, say like, you are a Spartan. The history of Sparta stands behind you and empowers you with the myths and legends. That, to me, way more valuable as a role for a bard than the bard being able to sing a song and make you feel better. I mean, I think the idea of being able to stir up the history, your legends, and make it feel like it's behind you. Like, I want to take some of these aspects of the totem spirits for barbarians and translate them over to a bardic inspiration. By the same token, there's the the next one in the list of the barbarian features are the Storm Herald. And that's more along the lines of infused with the natural elements, so that doesn't do as much good. The Berserker, that's just an angry rager. You could maybe add an aspect of stirring up a frenzy in somebody, but I don't think that's where we want to go with that yet. So the next one on the list for Barbarian is the Beast is a new one, and that's really more like werewolves and stuff. That's not really where we're going with that either. Battle Rager, that's not what we want to do either. That's just dwarves that follow the path of God of War. Ancestral Guardian, there we go. That was the next one on the real list that I think was most potentially useful. And that is, some barbarians hail from a culture that revere their ancestors. These tribes teach their warriors of the past, linger in the world as mighty spirits who can guide and protect the living. Bingo, right there. We can take that concept and the totem and use it in the same way that a bard can use, instead of the barbarian has the ability to tap into their ancestral spirits or a totem beast and tap into those powers. But a bard, I think, potentially has a set of abilities where they can tap into somebody else's thing for them. So it can connect you to your ancestors. It can connect you to the history. It can give you insight and understanding about what you're confronting. It can inspire you to think more clearly. And I feel like that's a more valuable route to go with the bard. I think that's pretty much it for the barbarian features. And so barbarian features, I don't know that I want them to necessarily, I don't think bards are suited for religious duty necessarily. Potentially spiritual. And I can potentially see them tapping into some of the abilities of the druid as we laid out. I feel like if you wanted to instill within a class of bard an ability like magic, the druid's path, where they, like I was talking about yesterday, where they build a battery of plant life, animal life, and a sacred grove where they go to recharge. I feel like the equivalent of that for a bard wouldn't be necessarily nature, but communities of people. So stories, legends, and songs, history, news, gossip, even. Being able to, I feel like instead of building a grove, a bard's potential should be building a network of people, a rumor mill, for the lack of a better term. And so I feel like if they were to build a grove, it would be a rumor mill, almost a guild, a guild that maybe they don't lead, and a network of informants. And their abilities, their battery, would have to be sort of their repertoire, their routine. Like a comedian has a stage routine. They may cycle through different routines. And I feel like the bard benefits most from, there are schools of magic that they tend to use in D&D to describe the different types of spells. And the schools of magic are abjuration, conjuration, divination, enchantment, evocation, illusion, necromancy, and transmutation. Now, off the top of my head, I would say enchantment, maybe illusion, those are likely to be the most relevant to a bard. I do feel like there's value in having the bard be somebody who can be a healer or a helper and I get where in history you're likely to have a bard who has storytelling as their main thing, maybe some divination. So divination and enchantment, maybe, to a small degree. But in a world where there are wizards, demonstratably, like D&D and video games that are inspired by D&D have a tendency to have that glaring difference. Like there's no question that a cleric, like if you've ever played a video game, somebody who's been a cleric or a priestly caste, they tap into divine power. There's never a question that they're doing that. There's never a point where like, oh, well, maybe it's not real. Maybe it's all in their heads. Like, no, there's always a sparkling cloud of light that enrobes them and then provides them power to achieve a certain effect. It's never questioned. So for divination spells, they have guidance and true strike. Now that's actually not a bad idea for cantrips. And comprehend language. I think that's like comprehend language and I feel like there's a cantrip called True Strike. You gain insight into a target's defenses. Your next turn, you gain advantage on your first attack against the target. So, and then guidance is sort of like inspiration. And so I do think like guidance, true strike, comprehend languages, that's within the purview of a bard. I do think bard is more likely to be one of those skill tree powerhouses. They're more likely to accumulate skills and knowledge than they are to have hocus pocus effects. But let's take a look at enchantment and see what they say for spells on enchantment, specifically cantrips, low-level spells. Okay, so 3 cantrips. Oh, yeah, encode thoughts, friendship, mind sliver. You can disorient people. Maybe. Vicious mockery. Charm person. Compelled duel. So that one sort of affects it to the point where your opponent is hung up on you and won't focus on anybody else. Dissonant whispers. Heroism. Imbue somebody with bravery. Like these are much more in line with what I would say is bardic. hideous laughter. Get somebody so hung up in laughing they can't concentrate or work well. Id insinuation. I think that's meant to be psychic attack. Sleep. I think calm emotions. Enthrall. The gift of gab. That's definitely sounds like something a bard would have. Oh, that is definitely a talent a bard needs. Have you ever been talking to the local monarch and accidentally mentioned how their son looks like your favorite hog from when you were growing up on the family farm? We've all been there, but rather than being beheaded for an honest slip of the tongue, you can pretend it never happened by ensuring that no one knows it happened. That is useful. That is bardic to a T. Suggestion. So you can suggest that somebody might want to try something, and they'll likely try to do that. That's not a bad one. All right, so like to me, this is more in line with what a bard should do. Not so much of the hocus pocus magic, although, having abilities that mirror spell abilities like those things I just read. So a bard yeah, I think that's going to take a lot of reworking. The base feature for Bard is a little more complicated to do. And honestly, you can play the game as is and get some decent use out of the Bard. Now, ooh, wow, we're 42 minutes in. Jeez, I didn't think I was getting that long. I may have to cover Ranger tomorrow. And then look at things like Monk. And the half magic classes. So let's have a look-see at Bard Magic and what they suggest for Bard Magic. Blade Ward, which is a defensive, I believe that you extend your hand and trace a sigil of warding in the air until the end of your next turn. You have resistance against bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage dealt by weapons attacks. That's a defensive, but Dancing Lights, Friends, Light, Mage Hand. Now, some of this is a callback to the days when the Bard used to be a subclass of Thief. Mending. I don't know that that quite fits the Bard. To be fair, I would use the heck out of that as a Bard. But that's more of like the game rules allow it to be something I can do, so I guess I could use that. Rather than flavor and story-wise what makes sense for the class. Messaging, Mind Sliver, Minor Illusion. I don't know how I feel about illusions. Prestidigitation, maybe. Thunderclap, True Strike, Vicious Mockery, Bane, Charm Person, Comprehend Languages, Cure Wounds, disguise self. Yeah, I think this is going to require like a whole rebuild of the class for me to figure out how it suits. But overall, I don't necessarily have an issue with giving some magic to a bard. I think my problem with it is, how is that magic structured? And I think overall, I'm inclined to go with the druidic way that I described yesterday, where they have a place of gathering energy from and a battery they can gather into and tap that battery, a sort of self-generating energy source, but limited, and tapping that battery for like the druid taps into plant life, and if they drain too much, that life withers and dies. A bard in this case would be tapping into a rumor mill or a community's identity. So maybe it's not like a home. Maybe the guild is their grove, and the communities they seed with bits of their stories and things that they pass on, and they can tap into that community consciousness. But tapping too much into it turns it from a welcoming and interactive community to a hostile community. You've pushed too far. You're not welcome here anymore, kind of thing. And so maybe it's a little bit more of a reputation. So your battery is a reputation. Your reputation, and the guild reputation is your grove. Not a bad way to go. And having new stories of heroic actions, like as you adventure, there's more things that you will see and witness, and it can boost your reputation. Having a reputation score, I do think that's probably the way to go. And like, I feel like the druid magic feature and the bardic magic feature, as well as the wizard, cleric, and warlock, all work really well for building mechanics that can work in a video game. I'm not sure sorcerer works as well, because the trick with sorcerer is their ability is literally one ability used in creative ways. That would be so much harder to pull off. All right, so I guess I'll have to cut it here because we're almost at 50 minutes. I didn't intend to be running this long. But tomorrow, I guess I'm going to have to take a look at Ranger tomorrow, and then I guess Monk after that. I didn't realize I was going to cover so much. And after Monk, I will potentially be doing maybe one or two more for the half magic classes. All right, that was a heck of a ramble. Who would have thought the bard? Well, for me, I guess that makes the most sense. The storyteller, the tinkerer, the artist. Yeah, it's not a surprise that maybe I have some feelings about bards. All right. So, with that in mind, thanks for joining me for my random ramble about world building for games and storytelling. I guess I'll be coming back to it tomorrow. I feel like I want this to maybe, like, I will probably revisit these in less rambly format at a later date, but this is sort of brainstorming a system that I may end up compiling into a couple of different types of playable games, and probably some fiction. All right. Well, thanks for joining me. Take care. Still got to write this out. And have a good night. Have a good night. I spelled Hava, H-A-V-A. World building is so much fun. This is an activity I really get into.